how and why communicators are so important right now and the key communication considerations. We work for Haggie Partners, one of the leading design and communications consultancies in the financial services sector. The majority of our clients are in the insurance industry, so we're well versed in the dynamics, the opportunities and the risks that the sector faces. This is actually my second time around at Haggie. I previously worked with them for about 5 years before joining Marsh in 2017 in their insurer consulting division, before joining Haggie as a director in July 2018. I work across a range of clients, managing both internal and external communications, and I also am part of the team developing new business at Haggie.
And I joined Haggie Partners as a PR director last year. Before that, I was working in a variety of in-house roles across insurance and financial services. So previously I worked at Canopius, PPL and Miller, as well as an investment banking role. I've always held fairly broad communications and marketing roles, including internal and crisis comms, so I'll be drawing on that experience today. I've also been a part of the Insurance Marketeers Group for a while and always found the sessions very useful and informative. So it's a pleasure to be here. I hope I can keep the standard up.
Why are we running this webinar today? There is a lot of uncertainty around how and when we will return to some version of normality. And as the UK government looks to reduce and mitigate some of the restrictions, businesses are having to consider A, whether or not people want to or need to return to the office, and if so, how they can ensure the health and safety of their employees in an office environment. What's critical to say is that there is no one correct route. So businesses really need to understand the tone and mood of their own organisation in understanding how to move forwards. What businesses say, and more importantly, how they say it, is critical at this time. And this is where you, as the marketing and communication experts, are key. It's your expertise in messaging, in understanding the tone of the business, and of being that bridge between the senior management team and the rest of the organisation is invaluable. You need to be in the room advising management on the messaging, using insights to create clear and meaningful communications. And in this webinar, we hope to provide some helpful advice around messaging at this time and points to remember for how your business should be and can be communicating to stakeholders. So if we take a quick look at the current environment, I think it's fair to say we are living and working in very bizarre times. We are just looking at the UK for the purpose of this webinar today. So the UK government has started to relax rules in the sense that individuals can now meet one other person from outside their household if they stay outdoors, and non-essential shops are expected to open on the 15th of June. However, for the time being, the advice does remain that anyone who can work from home should work from home. And what COVID-19 has shown is that, although not perfect, the insurance industry can successfully work from home. But this does not mean that companies are not spending a huge amount of time considering how and when to reopen their offices when the government allows. We're seeing an array of commentary from companies about their plans for the future. If we take a look at Facebook and Morgan Stanley, they've both said they're extending their working from home policies into 2021. Twitter has come out and said that employees can now work from home forever. Goldman Sachs has come out to say it's going to be running a hybrid model for the foreseeable future of people working from home and in the office. So what about the insurance and London market? On a regular day, roughly 7,000 people go through the doors of Lloyd's. They have said that they are not opening the underwriting room until September. And there's a question mark around what it will actually look like when it does open and even the role it should play. What has been positive about this crisis is that it has finally forced the industry to embrace electronic trading. And PPL has recently released data that has shown that since the crisis began, usage of PPL has hit a record high. So a year ago, the system was being used for about 970 policies per week in Lloyd's and the wider London market, and this has since risen to nearly 3,500. So in terms of how the underwriting room in Lloyd's might look when we reopen, John Neal has outlined 3 options. One is for insurers to be in the room, but the brokers join virtually. The second is that only certain product lines would be allowed in the room at once. And third is a booking system for people that want to use the building. But how do these options impact your business, your brokers, your insurers? Oh, the only thing we can be certain of is that preparation is key. Businesses need to prepare for a multitude of scenarios, and I think that's where efforts should be focused on at the moment. And of course, there are a number of challenges that this environment presents. We've looked at them and split them into 3 different areas. So your physical challenges, the operational and logistical challenges, and the emotional and mental health challenges. So if we take a look at the physical challenges, that's really around how your business operates in terms of footfall. Can you ensure that your employees will maintain a 2-metre distance? Do you need all roles back in the office? We're presuming that the majority of people attending this webinar work in insurance or wider financial services, so are largely office-based, work in the city and predominantly sit in an open plan office. Are you going to need to remove desks in order to maintain the health and safety guidelines? If so, how does that impact the number of people you can have on a floor at one time? Interestingly, the Canary Wharf Group has set out what it's putting in motion, and it's measures such as no passing on escalators, a maximum of 4 people in a lift at one time, hand sanitizers outside office entrances, and they're also installing additional bike racks. Would you be able to implement similar changes? Then if we look at the operational and logistical challenges, I think the main one there is really around how your employees reach the office. So while the train and bus and underground networks are running, the advice from TfL is to walk or cycle to work to reduce the pressure on services to allow priority to essential workers. And they also want people travelling to wear face masks. Now, you may have employees that for a myriad of different reasons do not want to travel on the tube or be in confined spaces. Also, if people are being encouraged to walk or cycle and they can walk or cycle to work, do you have enough shower facilities? Do you have enough bike racks to incorporate the influx of people that will be travelling this way? Equally, if this does continue and we end up with a sort of hybrid model where some people do return to the office, but some people are working from home, what support are you providing your managers and your people to help manage people remotely? Then there are the emotional and mental health challenges. COVID-19 has already caused a lot of mental and emotional anguish. You need to be very clear in communicating changes to your workforce and ensure that you give them a safe and open space to feedback on proposals. And equally, there should be no obligation for people to return to the office as and when you set a date for the office reopening. They may have dependents to care for, they may be in a high-risk group themselves, or they just might not be comfortable being in an office environment. And all of those challenges need to be taken into consideration. Yet, on the other hand, there are going to be people who are desperate to come back to the office. Those who potentially live and work now in a small space that don't really have access to any outside space, and who after 9 or 10 weeks of so lockdown are really keen to be back in an office environment. I think that what we can agree on is that this pandemic is a turning point in how we work, and companies really need to listen to what their employees want and then communicate how their working environment is going to adapt to this new working future. I will now hand over to Caroline.
Thanks, Becky. So how can communications teams help? I think it's important to start with that classic question, who is your audience? As Becky mentioned, for this webinar, we're largely assuming a city-based audience, but particularly we're largely assuming that you're talking to an internal audience. Of course, you will have external audiences to consider, clients, suppliers, other external stakeholders. But largely when you're thinking about the communications around a potential return to the office, it's an internal audience. Even within that, however, you've got different groups. Permanent staff, temporary staff, contractors, those who may have been furloughed, those who may not have, and if you're a large firm, you may have regional and global offices to consider. So it's important to consider the overall consistency of approach, while acknowledging that different groups or offices may require different information. Second slide, it's important to think about how we're communicating with our staff. And what's critical is to use a variety of communications channels, but wisely, trying not to flood people with information. Aim to make sure that your messages are clear and consistent across different mediums, remembering that people do take in information in different ways, whether it's email, telephone, post, whatever it may be. Email is obviously, well, it is the most obvious way of communicating these days, but we all know that people can get email fatigue. If you don't have a sort of a central branded email layout, perhaps now is the time to do it so that you can send out messages from senior management, central functions like HR that are branded and clearly laid out so that they don't merge into sort of the melee of all the emails that people receive. Video conferences are something we've all learnt to use and love over the last few weeks and months, and have actually worked brilliantly for many people. But it doesn't work always on such a big scale as the all-staff town halls. So it's worth considering using them as well for specific teams, and even just between managers and direct reports to make sure that people feel able to have conversations rather than just listen. Intranets are an incredibly useful resource at the moment for putting all the information so that people can go to one single point and find things that they may have missed. The other alternative to that is an external hub. So at Haggie, for example, we designed an external hub when we moved out of the office so that staff could access all the information that they needed for working remotely, and we created a couple of those for clients as well. That would be easy to repurpose for the other way around, so that people who are not in the office can just check where all the information is that they need. It's also important to make sure that managers are talking to staff, whether that's by email, telephone, just to make sure that people are not feeling left out. And when you're thinking about communicating a return to the office, well, the evidence so far is not that encouraging about how staff are thinking. Simon English of the Evening Standard recently quoted a survey from Carrion and Box. They surveyed more than 76,000 employees and found that a third have no confidence whatsoever in the ability of business leaders to navigate the crisis. Half of workers lacked motivation and 42% felt anxious, which is not hugely encouraging. So management really need to listen to staff in order to alleviate those concerns. The key point here is that communication goes two ways. Again, enlist managers' support, ask them for input, listen to what they're saying. And a recent Institute of Internal Communication survey showed that 47% of respondents are using line managers as a primary way to listen. But it's important to not only rely on them. Make sure that people have a way to ask questions. So I'm sure we're all now familiar with functions like Slido for big town hall meetings, but not everyone wants to put their hand up in a big meeting, even if it might look like anonymous. So consider other ways that they can ask questions. For example, a Q&A function on your intranet where people can ask questions anonymously, sending out surveys, and making sure that you do give the responses to those questions that you've asked. And I think in all of this, really, the key point is planning. I'm just going to have a quick drink. I think hope for the best and plan for the worst is a cliche, but it's widely used for a reason. You cannot plan for everything, but the better prepared you are, the more confident and the more comfortable you'll feel when unexpected eventualities arise, which they will. We all know they will. So think now about how your team can add value. Start listening. Start finding out what's going on. Ask questions. I always say never be afraid to ask questions, and make sure that you're communicating with the teams across the business who are part of this planning process. If you're an internal team, an internal communications team sitting within perhaps an HR function, you may be pretty well connected with what's going on. But if you sit with other functions, you may not hear so much of what's being planned. So think about proactively talking to areas like HR, facilities, BCP, legal, all those who may be involved in this. Most importantly, talk to senior management and get their steer on the approach that they want to take, because that will set the tone for everything. Once you've got that, you can put together an overall communication strategy that articulates what the key messages are and what the overall approach is, even if you cannot scenario plan for absolutely everything. And importantly, I would say don't be afraid to contribute and lead. Communications teams have a hugely important role to play, not only in disseminating information, but also acting as a sense check for plans and proposals. I would say as well from experience that it's very easy to assume that someone else is taking the lead, particularly in a situation like this where you may be surrounded by really quite senior people. I used to have a motto in a previous team, never assume. And usually going back to where things went slightly awry, it was because at some point one of us had said to ourselves, usually me, I assume so-and-so is doing that. I assume that person is taking on that. And sometimes they hadn't. So don't assume that someone else is doing it. Always offer and contribute. And don't forget that as professional communicators, your colleagues need your counsel and they will be glad that you're offering it. So moving on and thinking about what people want to know. I worked with a CEO for a while who had a very wise thing that he said to me, which is that the first thing that people think about when they read a piece of communication or they hear a piece of news is, how does this impact me? You know, further down the line, they'll think about lots of other questions, but the first thing that they want to know is, how does this impact me? How does this affect me? So consider the topics that you'll need to cover and how that will land with your audience. As Becky mentioned, things like potentially a phased return, safety measures, new policies and procedures, staggered hours, timeframes, all these things will need to be communicated. And again, make sure it's easy to find. Consider that internal or external hub and reassure people that they'll be given notice of any changes that are coming. So if we think about a general approach, Becky mentioned, and as I mentioned in the survey, staff will be feeling unnerved and anxious. It's a very unusual time. So clarity is really important. Be aware of potential confusion that could be caused by media speculation and even internally from those with personal agendas to push. I think it's important to make clear to staff that although nothing will happen before government guidelines allow it and before health and safety parameters are set in place, decisions about what your company does will be taken by your company. So speculation in the media or from the chap you know in accounts at the other broker down the road is not the point. Make it clear to staff that they will be communicated with and your company will tell them what's going on. There are some good and bad examples out there of this kind of communication, some internal, some external. You'll have no doubt heard of Virgin Atlantic making a number of its staff unfortunately redundant recently. And if you look at the announcement they put out, it's a sterling example of how not to do it. I think it takes 2 pages before they get to the critical point for their staff of a lot of blurb and fluff before they get to that point. On the other hand, the Airbnb CEO recently sent out a communication that was the same externally and internally, made it clear right at the start that unfortunately they were going to be losing staff, set out why, and set out exactly what they were going to be doing to help those staff. That's a great example of how to be clear. So that really comes from the leadership approach, and that's so vital, as I've said. If you get that clear, it will set the tone for everything. It will set the clarity and the consistency that you need. As I've said, there may need to be some differences in terms of the information that you're providing across teams or global or regional offices. There may need to be changes in approach over time as government advice changes. But if you can keep the company's priorities and the general tone and approach clear and consistent, that will help to reassure staff. And it goes without saying that showing empathy and kindness, showing that consideration of staff fears, staff personal situations is important. Leadership, I think, has been an interesting thing that we've seen changing over the past few weeks and months. Staff have seen that leaders are working from home just as they are. You know, they might have a slightly bigger house, but nonetheless, they're still being interrupted by cats on the keyboard, children coming into their meeting, which I'm slightly wary of even here, doorbells ringing for postmen, all that kind of thing. And leadership has had to be rather more genuine and rather more direct in the way that they're communicating with staff. And I think people really appreciate that. So I think we can summarise what communicators need to be thinking about in 6 key points, really. The first of those, as I've mentioned, is clarity of purpose from management. That sets the tone for everything. Secondly, clarity in communicating expectations from staff, your plans and your approach. Third, openness to feedback. I've mentioned giving staff a way to ask questions, to give feedback to management. But it's really important to respond to that and to make sure that the feedback and questions staff give are not just disappearing into black hole. You can always post responses to questions on your intranet if you have a Q&A function there, or respond in big town hall meetings. However it is, make sure that staff feel their concerns are being heard. And that goes towards that demonstrating empathy to what they're worried about. We talked a little bit about planning. It's really important to plan, but you can't plan for everything. So it's good to think about the scenarios you may be facing, give yourselves confidence in your ability to respond to different scenarios, but also confidence to be flexible and to move away from those plans if the situation demands it. And finally, what I would say is, and this may be the hardest thing to do at the moment, is look to the future. It is tricky to lift our eyes up, as it were, from the quagmire of coronavirus-related concerns. But we do know that at some point in the future, things will go back to something more like what we were previously used to. And I think it's really worth considering the lessons that we've learned from communicating through this crisis, what we've done well, what we haven't done well, what we want to do more of in the future that's worked really well through this time. One of those, I think, is this more direct approach from leadership that staff have valued. But you will know from what you've been doing what's worked well, what hasn't, and what you can learn from. So I would say start making notes, start thinking about that now, and just have that one eye on the future. So finally, I just want to briefly mention the resources that we've included on the last slide, which give you a few places to perhaps go and have a look at. We recently wrote a blog on returning to the office, which you might like to take a look at. The surveys I mentioned are listed there, as well as those good and bad examples of communicating, and of course the government resources that are available to everyone. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time, and we hope you find this a useful webinar to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you very much.